and all the ways in which birds have been so important in his life. So I'm going to turn that over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and I know that I'm among friends when on a Friday night people voluntarily spend their evening geeking out about birds and about travel. So I feel like this is the best form of audience I could possibly have, and the fact that we've set the bar so low with technical issues means that we can only go up from here, right? So I'm grateful that we are in this space together. And in total, I hope to share some of the things that I have learned over my travels, my studies, and my earliest life experiences that can help clue you into some of the reasons why I'm passionate about birds, and maybe you can find some of your own passion there as well. Does that sound good? Yeah, all right. I want to also thank Modesto Area Partners in Science for hosting me tonight, and also I'm grateful for this speaker series and that I get to be the first one. So if the bar is set high, then everybody else looks bad. If the bar is set really, really low, then great, nobody will know the difference. So I hope that we have a lot of fun together tonight. My talk is called Birds from Museums to the Wild, and I'm using these two kind of formative seasons of my life, working in museums and working with wild birds, to tell you a little bit about my own story of how I became a professional ornithologist. But to start that story, I want you to kind of focus in here. You don't have to close your eyes, but focus in on this forest path. So a couple decades ago, a young boy was blindfolded. He was taken on a cold, cloudy morning to a place that he was unfamiliar with. And the people who were with him knew something that he didn't. When that blindfold came off, it was a surprise birthday party for a 5-year-old boy who received his first pair of binoculars, and he was in fact at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, one of the best places in the world to study birds. This is a view of that same path that I was a little boy, if you haven't guessed, that I walked when I was turning 5 years old. And at the time, I looked something like this. And this was what my binoculars looked like. So how do you go from being someone who is young and receiving your very first pair of the ability to see the world in a new way, this new piece of equipment, how do you go from there to what I looked like this past summer, halfway around the world with a completely different piece of optical equipment, but doing the same thing? So I want to tell you a story that ties together space and time and geography through the lens of birds. So those early days, me with my new pair of binoculars around my neck, I would have been looking at things like this American goldfinch that would be feeding on thistles in my backyard, or the red-tailed hawk that was soaring over the farms and fields nearby where I grew up, or maybe this barn swallow that would have nested just above the door to my garage, and I could peek out my window and watch those nestlings grow over the course of the season. Or this ruby-throated hummingbird that would come and feed at the hummingbird feeder that my mom hung up. So these early days, I was able to see a set of birds that characterized an area of the United States that, if you're familiar with birds, you would recognize as the temperate Northeast. So here's a map. We'll be exploring some maps over the course of tonight to fit with the theme, the wonderful acronym that we're working with here. So the map of my story starts in upstate New York. If we zoom in on where I was, you can see here is upstate Western New York, and close to the city of Ithaca, which is where that Cornell Lab of Ornithology Sapsucker Woods birthday surprise location was. Zooming in even further, you can see close to the city of Ithaca, it was this little town of Dryden. And that star is almost exactly on the road where I grew up. So far, far, far from any city. And what did this little town do? Well, the main theme of the town was agriculture. And in fact, the largest celebration every year was a festival that celebrated the dairy history of the area. Dairy Days was an annual an annual festival when people would come together, walk their cows down Main Street, have floats of celebrating their farms, drive tractors, and it would all end with people having cows in the local park, and a lot of ice cream being eaten and milk being drunk. And so in this town, this is the end of the road that I grew up on, and I literally lived in a place where the pavement ended. And beyond that pavement, those were cow pastures that really characterized this region. And so when living in a place like that, and a place that in slightly other locations along Cayuga Lake, where you could hike in the forest and spend a lot of time within a more of a deciduous forest environment, what do you do during the summer and spring and fall, but you spend time outdoors? And on the other hand, what do you do during the winter, but read, do a lot of reading. And so I would read books like Modoc, about a boy who grew up in tandem with a circus elephant in Germany, or The Call of the Wild and White Fang, books by Jack London, or maybe My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George. And while I didn't have a pet elephant or wolf, and certainly not a falcon, I did have a pet chicken. And this flock of chickens actually was, it was two things. It was a wonderful vision of animal behavior up close and personal. And it was also my first opportunity to experience business and creating value. So I kept the chickens, took care of them, but then I also sold their eggs, and that was my money to keep. And I felt like, wow, I've just done something. I've really created value that other people appreciated. And that played into my life later on. But alongside the chicken, I also had pet birds. This was my cockatiel Sylvester. That's me in the middle on the right with my sister and cousin. And so it was a lot of time spent outdoors, a lot of time spent in nature, and watching birds right up close. And these were really formative experiences because they gave me the opportunity to see birds in a way that was hard given the pair of binoculars that I had. The magnification wasn't too great. Birding in forests can be particularly technical and challenging. And these experiences of nature up close allowed me to begin to ask questions. It reminded me of this first lesson that I want to share with you tonight. And that is that what is close to home informs one's worldview and can inspire your imagination. And so these early experiences gave me this sense of direction with my love of birds. And it inspired me to go to the types of places that Modoc and White Fang and My Side of the Mountain were set. So these places that were outdoors and maybe far from home, and that certainly were not dead-end streets. And as I took the next step in my life, I carried these two questions with me. Firstly, why do birds do what they do? Why do they behave in the way that they do? And what is informing those decisions? The second question that I was asking was, how do people impact birds? When we are farming, when we are changing the landscape around us, how are we changing the behavior and the distribution of the birds around us? So the next step of my journey was to go to college at a place called Wheaton College. So I left my hometown in New York, took a train about 1,000 miles, and landed just west of Chicago, Illinois. And this was a place where I would end up spending a total of about 7 years of my life. And at Wheaton College, I took that interest in business that I had first experienced when I was selling those chickens' eggs. And I actually majored in business, but at the same time I majored in biology because I was interested in the living world and what we can learn from it. That rural upbringing was so instrumental in determining the direction that I went in terms of a career. But I loved business, and so I actually combined the two of them in what's called an interdisciplinary studies program, and I was able to actually think about the synthesis between these two fields rather than thinking about them in a silo. And in order to do that, I took the next step of my journey between my junior and senior year of college, and I left Chicago, Illinois, and went all the way to a little town called Ngaramtoni, just west of Arusha, Tanzania. And from Wheaton College, I went to work with ECHO East Africa. This is a sustainable agricultural development organization that works with smallholder farmers. So I was continuing this theme of thinking about agriculture and land use change and trying to explore this question of how have we impacted birds. And my work with ECHO East Africa, there you can see it a little bit closer up, placed me in this region of northern Tanzania. This was the view from my house, and it's a Afro-montane forest region. And much of these hills has been transitioned into agriculture. So people are smallholder farmers growing crops like corn and beans, and these are cash crops that support the majority of the population. And the rainfall and soils are a little bit more consistent and higher quality in this region of Tanzania than they are in the lowland plains, where there's more pastoralism and livestock keeping. While I was in this location in Tanzania, I interviewed farmers about how they were, about their farming practices, about how they were caring for the land and what types of crops they were producing. With a team of Tanzanian college students, I then did tree and bird biodiversity surveys of these farmers' fields. And in total, I sought to answer this question of how do people's farming practices affect the biodiversity that surrounds them? And can biodiversity actually be a benefit to the livelihoods of people who live in agricultural regions? And what I was able to find was that in the farms where there was greater tree diversity, there was also greater bird diversity, and that included birds that would do things like eat the seeds of pest plants. So there was the potential to have fewer weeds on the field of a farmer that had more diverse tree assemblage around them. Pretty cool. And then when I came back to the States, I then published what I had found, first in English, and then because I wanted to make it accessible to the community where I'd lived, I worked with one of the people who I'd lived with in Tanzania to translate it into Swahili so that it would be available to the farmers who I had been working with. And this is, the title of this is the importance of biology on smallholder farms with, let's see. Yeah. So working with biology on smallholder farms of corn, and then the importance of birds is that second header, and so it explores this combination of how birds and trees and farmers can actually be working together to produce better yields in an area where no one can irrigate their crops. All of these were rain-fed fields. And those hours that I spent out in these fields watching birds, doing these things called point counts, where you stand in one place and just watch, record everything that you see, reminded me of my next lesson, and that is that deep observation really matters. It matters when you get to know a place. I ended up spending 7 months in Tanzania, learning to speak Swahili, living with a Tanzanian family throughout that whole time, and building deep relationships. And I realized that none of that could have happened had it been a much shorter time, and I wouldn't have been able to observe the landscape in the same way if I had come for a more brief period of time and then left. And so really coming to understand the system, this type of deep observation, it really matters. And it inspires our curiosity to then also ask more questions. What is the next thing that we need to know about this place now that we've looked past just the surface level? So this is kind of lesson number 2. Deep observation matters. At the end of those 7 months, I left Tanzania and went all the way back to Chicago, Illinois, and completed my undergraduate degree. And it was quite the shock. I had gone from 7 months in, just south of the equator, to it was late December in Illinois, and could not have been more different. The days were short and cold and dark, and suddenly instead of hearing Swahili around me every day, I was hearing English, and that English was academic English. It was high information density English. So I was needing to write papers and take many classes, and it was a total culture shock. And it made me wish that I was back in Tanzania. But after I graduated, I had no idea what to do to continue work with birds. And so I remember sending an email just 1 month before I was going to walk a graduation to the only person who I knew who had ever worked with ornithology in a professional setting. Her name is Holly Lutz, shout out to Holly. And I had met her when I was in high school in upstate New York. And I sent her this email and I said, Holly, I'm just about to graduate from college. I want to work with birds. What would be my first step into that field? And Holly said, Sean, if you want, I have connections at the Field Museum in downtown Chicago, and you could go and see whether museum ornithology is something that you would enjoy. So I sent an email to the person in charge there at the Field Museum and began working as a volunteer in the bird research collections. So the Field Museum has bird collections that include many species, from the American woodcock in the upper left. This is an upland shorebird that consumes worms mostly, and it's hunted pretty extensively throughout the eastern and southern United States, to this cedar waxwing that is an entirely frugivorous bird that's highly reliant upon wherever there are fruiting plants. And so it's basically living a nomadic lifestyle. To this yellow warbler down in the lower left that sings one of the sweetest songs in the spring. To the fastest bird in the world, the peregrine falcon, which would nest on building ledges in downtown Chicago. And so working in this museum, I was being exposed to birds in a way that I had never experienced before. And it was working with dead birds and preparing them as museum specimens. Now, there are 4 main ways in which you can prepare a specimen. You could have an egg clutch. So that would be removing all of the insides of the egg and keeping the eggshell intact with all of the biological data associated with that species and the location and time when it was collected. You can also have a study skin, and this is kind of the equivalent of taxidermy. It's removing all of the interior of a bird's body, stuffing it with cotton, sewing it back up, and having all of the feathers kept in place so that you're able to look at things like feather color and pattern. You can also prepare a museum specimen as a skeleton. And this involves removing all of the feathers and the soft tissues and only keeping the bones. Or you can have a fluid specimen. And these are birds that are preserved normally in alcohol, sometimes in formalin, where the bird's entire body and all of its feathers are preserved. And so this was a completely new way of experiencing birds. And after about 6 months of volunteering, I got a part-time job working in the insect collections. And about 6 months after that, they hired me part-time in the bird collections, and then about 8 months later, I was full-time in the bird collections. And so it took over 1.5 years to finally land in a staff position at this museum. And so that's where the Field Museum is located. And the staff position that I was hired on for, first part-time, was was called Plume, Phenotype Linkage Utilizing Multimedia in Emu. It's a total mouthful. But it makes for a nice acronym when you're working with birds. So the phenotype is the externally visible morphology of the bird, how it appears to the outside world, and linking that to all of the rest of the specimen data in Emu, which is the specimen database that the Field Museum uses. And the reason why I was working on this project was because Chicago, Illinois is one of the most challenging places for a bird to migrate through. Many songbirds migrate at night, and they're navigating by the stars. And this means that they can avoid aerial predators during the daytime. They can also avoid some of the stronger winds that come up once the sun has heated up the surface of the earth and you begin to have winds later in the day. And so they are migrating at night, they're looking up at the stars, and they're moving around Lake Michigan, trying to avoid open water if possible. And they encounter a brightly lit cityscape with skyscrapers that project lights high into the sky, and low buildings that have big plate glass windows that look like they are something that could be flown through. And so every year, the Field Museum and a team called the Chicago Bird Collision Monitors collect over 5,000 birds that fly into and die in the process of hitting these buildings in Chicago. And so this produces this enormous workload of preparing all of these specimens, and it's a workload that never stops. And so many of those specimens end up as skeletal specimens. But yeah, so Field Museum staff and volunteers collect these birds, record their data, and also collect biological data on each of these birds, weighing, measuring them, assigning them a number that will stay with them through the specimen process. And then what we did before preparing them as skeletal specimens was imaging these birds with wings and tail spread out, where you're looking both at the back of the bird and also at the bird's belly. And what this does is it produces a data set that had never been produced before, which is the plumage data of migratory birds at scale. And when you are preparing a study skin, the wings are closed and are held against the bird's body. And so you lose a lot of the vision of what those feathers would have looked like. And so what we were trying to do was to capture all of the variation on those feathers. After we took those images, the birds were prepared as skeletons. This is using a dermestid beetle colony, so it's actually live beetles that decay any kind of animal that has died in the wild. And at the Field Museum now for over 45 years, there has been a colony of these beetles kept in aquariums, and these beetles are used to prepare skeletal specimens without the use of any chemicals and in a way that is much more precise than if you were to try to do that work by hand. And plus, they're volunteers, they all work for free. And after that is done, then the cleaned skeleton is cataloged and added to the museum's permanent collection. And those digital images that we have taken are attached to that collection record in the museum's database. So someone is able to go and both study that skeleton and also look at images of what that bird looked like at the time that it had died. But what do those birds look like? Oh, actually, before that, this is what that workflow looked like in person. So my colleague Kaylee is the one sitting down, and our other colleague Tiana is the one off to the left, and I'm the one taking the images. And it's all happening in rapid sequence. Obviously not quite this fast, but bird after bird is imaged on its underside and then on its back to try to collect that image data. Imagine just doing this for 6 hours. So once those photos are taken, here's what they look like. So we have this yellow-rumped warbler. Historically, it was called Dendroca coronata. Now it's Setophaga coronata. And this is the myrtle warbler subspecies. So this is, you can see from the white throat that this is the eastern subspecies that you would find in Chicago. The yellow-rumped warblers here have a bright yellow throat. And so we imaged it on its belly and then again on its back. And so now we can see all of those feathers. And this was done at scale. So These numbers are from 2019, so at the time, 105,000 bird specimens were salvaged from window collisions. Now that number is a little over 120,000 specimens. And 6,500 birds salvaged annually. Last year was a record-breaking year with a combination of a storm event and the time of year that pushed birds down into the city. Over 9,000 birds were collected in a single year, and those are only the ones that people have found. Many of those birds are prepared as skeletons each year, and at the time that this was produced, 3,454 photographs had been taken. That number is now over 5,300. And as you can see, this is 99 species photographed of 62 different genera and 26 different families. And for context, the Field Museum has a collection of over 500,000 bird specimens, about 530,000, and those specimens encompass about 8,500 species. And so by doing this at scale, we were producing this totally novel data set and making it available to the scientific community and to the broader community totally for free. And this was particularly important because when I worked there in 2019, it was just before the start of the COVID pandemic. And soon people could no longer access museum collections in person. And so to be able to have an online resource like this, there suddenly became a lot more attention on museum accessibility through photographs. And if you were to go to collections-zoology.fieldmuseum.org, you'd also be able to view or download these images and the associated data of those exact birds. So pretty amazing resource that I never knew when I was in college would have been a possibility, but ended up being on the cutting edge of producing it. Now I want to pause here for just a moment, because working at a museum that has the largest hanging gardens in the world, it did at the time, they've since been removed, these beautiful museum grounds, a remarkable collection of birds like this Katinga that I'm holding here. It's easy to look at that and say, this person had it made, that is just the dream job, and I could never ever do that. And I want to say that it was a total journey to work at this museum. When I graduated, I was a student who had paid part of my way through college. I had a very little familial support and needed to stay in the city of Chicago. For a time, because I wasn't doing paid work during those first 6 months of volunteering, I was homeless. I was bouncing from couch to couch of people who I knew. And then when I did have an apartment, then it was a 1-bedroom apartment and 3 people in it. And so these journeys that we take sometimes are extremely uncomfortable. And they demand a kind of commitment that is sometimes not possible to meet. And the only reason why I was able to end up working full-time at this museum was because of a supportive community of people at the museum and in the greater Chicago area who were looking out for me at the time. And so I want to say that community is really vital when we want to pursue the things that we dream to pursue. I could have left this opportunity to take a job that would have paid more, but would have removed all of my time and energy, and it would have set me on a totally different path than working in museums. And instead I decided I'm going to take these sacrifices in order to pursue this thing that I love. When I was just 10 months old, even before that 5th birthday, my first word was bird. That was the first word that I ever said. So I've always felt that there's this kind of like divine joy of experiencing birds that transcends all of the logical things of, birds have a lot of cultural value and economic value. And yes, those things are all true. But for me, I think that there is this lifelong calling and passion for studying birds. And so in order to follow that, I took these sacrifices that are maybe invisible to a lot of people when just looking at my CV or like overall life story. But I want you to know, as people who are in this space with me tonight, that these are things that I experienced, and that life often throws us harder things than we know, and we have to deal with them in the moment. And I also encourage you to be really compassionate to people who may be experiencing those things on their own and may be working really hard to hide it. I remember taking the train from Wheaton, where I was living, into downtown Chicago and not having money to pay the train fare and hiding in the bathroom of the train when the ticket taker walked past. And so I think that it's really important to have compassion for the people who we may come across in our life and have no sense of the things that they are struggling through in order to pursue the things that they love. So while I was working at the Field Museum, that was there in Chicago, I attended a conference way up in Alaska that was a bird research conference. And that was what really ignited my clarity of focus to say, I do want to pursue biology as a graduate degree. Because I'd studied both biology and business, there had been this open question of, do I go on to maybe do a graduate degree in business or in accounting or economics, or maybe I do something like ecology or conservation biology. And because of the clarity that that conference gave me, seeing that, yes, I do want to do work with birds, I ended up taking a new journey, and I moved to the city of Los Angeles. And while I was there, I studied at Cal State LA. So I'm a product of the CSU system. And Cal State Los Angeles was a place where I felt like I could combine my interest in birds with my background in museums and my hope to do ecological work in the future. And so I worked on this project that was focused on historical ecology. And it used museum specimens to create models of where birds would have been living before the city of Los Angeles was built. And because Los Angeles is such a young city, we actually still have those physical specimens around and the locations where those birds were collected. And so then those models, we could see exactly where birds would have lived in the historical landscape. And then I compared those to birds in the modern landscape of LA. So we could take a bird like Anna's hummingbird, and this is a bird that we have here in Modesto. Anna's hummingbird is kind of the pinker cousin of the ruby-throated hummingbird that I would have seen when I was growing up. And in the pre-urban landscape of Los Angeles, it would have been tracking with the foothill areas, basically where you would have found oak savannas and a vibrant wildflower community. In the urbanization process, people have planted flowering trees and plants from around the world across Los Angeles. And so what happened after urbanization really benefited this bird. So it experienced an overall increase of 211% occupancy between that historical, that pre-urban, and the modern urban cityscape. And so this was a really exciting finding. And I did this not only for Anna's hummingbird, but for 30 different focal species. And you can see that the Anna's hummingbird is pretty close to the top. Black Phoebe did even better, 430% increase in occupancy between that historical and modern occupied cells comparison. And then there were a lot of other birds that experienced minor gains or losses, birds like California scrub jay and Hutton's vireo. And then there were some birds that really took some drastic hits. So things like western tanager, yellow warbler, and then you look even further down, burrowing owl, 100% loss. So it was no longer found as a breeding bird in the Los Angeles cityscape after urbanization. These are birds that require grasslands, which used to be found in LA, and now the wall-to-wall urbanization gives them no place to live. And so this, for me, was a great reminder of this next iteration of trying to answer that question: how do humans impact birds? We have birds in agricultural settings in Tanzania, and the ways that tree planting decisions affect their diversity. We have urbanization here in Los Angeles and how it affects bird occupancy of breeding birds. And so this question continues to kind of sit with me. My next step, after completing my master's degree in Los Angeles, was to move actually it's maybe one of the shortest distance moves I've made yet, and that was to move up to the city of Merced to start a PhD. And that's where I currently am, working on my PhD in ornithology. And UC Merced was an interesting choice for me, because when I was doing my master's, I thought, okay, if I'm going to go on to a PhD, I want to do work that is really core to who I am and who I see birds to be. And so I asked myself the question, what is it that first ignited my passion in birds? And I thought back to those days when I had been watching my chickens running around the yard, or those captive birds that I had as pets moving around. And I thought, I want to study behavior. And on top of studying behavior, I want to look at birds in the wild, so not captive behavior. And if I'm going to work on birds in the wild, I really want to go back to that place where I lived 7 years before in Tanzania. And so that work took me from Merced to this kind of third chapter of my life that I want to share with you, which I'll call the wild. So yeah, this is me in the field with a way better pair of binoculars than I had as a kid, and a camera that I do not own. and these are some of the birds that I began to see. So UC Merced gave me the opportunity to study birds in Mozambique. And so I spend a couple months of the year in the field in Mozambique studying birds that live only in southern Africa. Along the way, I'm seeing birds like this little bee eater in the upper left that I photographed earlier this summer, or these greater flamingos that lived at Lake Urema that is at the very center of my study area. This Narina trogon sitting on a branch. It's the only member of its family in southern Africa. And this southern ground hornbill on the lower right-hand side. So you can see this is a pretty far cry from that American goldfinch and red-tailed hawk that I was seeing when I was growing up. The characters have changed, but the story remains a riveting one for me. So that work took me from, as I said, Merced down to central Mozambique. And in Mozambique, I work in this place, Parque Nacional da Gorongosa. Gorongosa is the flagship national park of Mozambique. And it is an area that has a very unique ecological history. From 1977 to 1992, Mozambique was in the grips of its civil war. It had left colonial control from the Portuguese just a couple years prior, and the new government was challenged by a set of opposition leaders, and this civil war lasted 15 years. In the process, over 1 million Mozambican people died. It was a horrific, horrific war. The resistance army set up its headquarters here in Gorongosa National Park. And in the process, they killed elephants and sold their ivory to buy arms. They killed large antelopes for food. They killed large carnivores. And in total, the park lost about 90% of the animals that were living there, of the large animals. The small animal community stayed relatively intact, so things like lizards and snakes were still in good stead, but the large-scale animals on the landscape had declined. And so ever since the Civil War ended and the park has reopened to both visitors and scientists, ecologists have been studying this location to try to understand how an ecosystem returns to equilibrium after catastrophic disaster. So when I ask this question of how are people impacting birds, this is a place where I can study how people impact birds in the context of war. But what birds would still be alive after a war ended in 1992 that I could study today? And this is the answer. That southern ground hornbill that we saw on that cast of characters slide just a few slides ago, these are birds that live a very, very unique life. They are a communally breeding bird. They are the world's largest communally breeding bird. So what that means is they live in groups, and those groups are consisting of only one female and a lot of adult males. One of those is her mate, and the others are basically mercenaries. They are helping to defend their territory against other groups of hornbills. Most of those are her adult sons, and they are helping to not only defend the territory, but the next time that she goes to breed, they're helping to find food in the landscape and bring it to her baby to help it grow. So they are actively cooperating in this breeding effort. On top of that, southern ground hornbills do really wacky things in other arenas. When it comes to what they eat, they are eating things as extreme as venomous snakes, which they will eat whole. They consume tortoises that they pick out of their shells. They'll eat hares, so rabbits that they will hunt communally. So one bird will scare the rabbit out of hiding and another bird will catch it. And so they have this very unique dietary history. But on top of that, they live to be 70 years old. And so if I want to study a bird that has lived through the war, these birds are living testaments to that period of time in Gorongosa's history. On top of that, it's a species that is declining throughout its range. Because it lives so long and is so territorial, it doesn't do well when people encroach upon its territories with urban development or certain forms of agriculture. It is willing to put up with things like cattle pasturing, and it will happily just forage among grazing cattle. But for other forms of like row crop agriculture, it's much less likely to persist. On top of all of that, it's declining throughout its range, but in Gorongosa National Park, it is doing really well. It is considered to be potentially the most dense population of ground hornbills anywhere in the world. And aerial surveys that are flown in October every 2 years, one is going to be flown just next month, to count large animals in the landscape, also count hornbills incidentally. So because these birds are so big, you can see them from a light aircraft that's flying transects over the national park. And so people are able to count how many birds there are. And so while it may be an undercount, because some birds may not fly when the plane flies over, it is a consistent sampling method. And the number of birds has been increasing every 2 years. And so not only are they super dense, but it seems like they are continuing to grow in population. And this produces some really interesting questions about what happens when a territorial bird begins living in an ever more and more dense environment. Imagine people living in a rural area versus people living in a city. And they begin to act a bit differently when they have a set of nearby neighbors than when their neighbors are far down the road. And so because they've been most extensively studied in South Africa, where territories are really large and where the hornbill is considered endangered, I really wanted to go to Mozambique to study them in a place where they are doing really well and to give us a sense of what we might learn and apply to their conservation elsewhere. And so I spent a couple of months in South Africa and Mozambique this year, so all of June and all of July, and I watched ground hornbills in Parque Nacional de Gorongosa to try to understand where groups are located. And this sets me up for future research to look at group size, group composition, and persistence of groups on the same territories year over year. While I was there, I took photos of birds from the cab of a truck. And in this case, there were actually a couple of lions, which you can see in the background, which is funny because my last name is Lyon. But when I was looking at hornbills, I wanted to capture pictures of their faces. They have unique sideburns that are characteristic of an individual. And so if you are able to detect slight differences in those facial feathers, then you can accurately identify individuals and then characterize which groups they are a part of. And so I spent this whole summer driving, looking for groups of hornbills and taking photos of them. On top of that, hornbills are one of the only species of birds that plays as adults. So in a lot of species, you see young birds playing, and this is often a way of gaining skills or gaining socialization experience. But in ground hornbills, they engage in both object-based play, tossing things around, stripping bark off of trees, but they also engage in social play, jumping on each other, wrestling, playing king of the castle with termite mounds and trying to knock each other off the top. And whoever wins is the one who gets to stay on top of the termite mound. And so I really wanted to return to these places where I could see these behaviors in the wild. And here is another form of data that I collected while I was in Mozambique this summer, and that is aerial photography and videography of birds foraging. So because these birds live in social groups, they're needing to stay together when they're looking for food. And one bird is often kind of at the front of the group, determining, or it may be determining where that group moves. And so I used drones that I habituated the birds to get a sense of how they're moving through space. And here is those two birds in flight up into a tree. You can see that characteristic white outer wingtip. So when the drone got too close or when it got too dark, then they would fly up into a tree for safety. And so this gives a whole nother dimension to how we can understand ground hornbill behavior using technology that is hard to access and yet can produce really high resolution understanding of how they're moving through space. And so that goes back to that earliest question that I was asking: how are birds making the decisions that they are? How are they moving through space and time? So my current work with ground hornbills is trying to get at that question. And along the way, I was able to photograph birds doing really unbelievable things. This bird had just killed a snake in the grass, and you can see it just disappearing down its throat. And this is the first documentation of a hornbill eating a snake in this particular park. And this is important because one of the things that hornbills have to do when they're young and foolish is they need to learn how to do all of the skills that the adults in their group are able to do, and acquiring food is one of them. But some forms of food are dangerous, like a poisonous snake that could bite you. And so they need to learn from the adults how exactly to go about acquiring that food item. And so it's really special when you can actually see these behaviors in the wild. It also makes hornbills very much endeared to people in communities that live alongside them, because it means that if the ground hornbills are around, you have fewer snakes to worry about. So ground hornbills really helped me remember that no path is direct. Because of this background going from birds in agriculture in Tanzania to urbanscapes in Chicago, urbanscapes in Chicago with migratory birds, to urbanization and how it impacts birds in LA, then suddenly I'm now working on the behavior of these birds in a wild context in Mozambique, and it's been a very circuitous path. And so to remember that no path is direct is bolstered by this idea that good work often happens slowly. Had I not spent those years working at the Field Museum, I certainly wouldn't have done that master's working with museum data. And it takes the slow building of a knowledge base to become good at what you do, and I certainly have so much to learn. And so to be able to do good work, I think that it takes us to different places than we might otherwise anticipate, and that is just a slow process. So I think embracing the slowness of doing the work that we have a love and passion to do is an important part of pursuing the things that we love. And when we do so, it opens up these new horizons. Maybe it's a horizon like this one in Gorongosa. Maybe it's a horizon of something that you care about that is a dream that you are pursuing. Maybe that is biological anthropology, or maybe that's computer science. Who knows what the thing may be that you want to get a degree in or make a career out of. But by pursuing those things, new horizons can open up, and I think that my life has been continually reminding me of embracing the slowness of that process. So where have we been? We've learned that what is close to home really informs your worldviews. It inspires your imagination. And that deep observation of the things that are around you at any stage of life really matters. And it causes you to ask more questions. And no path is a direct path, and that good work often happens really slowly and incrementally. But also, along those long and slow journeys, there are so many people and places and institutions that enable us to do the things that we love. And some of those that have been part of my story are Wheaton College, where I did my undergrad, Cal State LA, where I did my master's, Merced, where I'm currently working on my PhD, maybe the Field Museum in Chicago, where I first experienced that taste of museum work that I carried into multiple institutions afterwards, or ECHO, East Africa Impact Center, where I worked in Tanzania. And certainly even here in Modesto at the Great Valley Museum, there are opportunities to do science, to do good work, and to learn something about this beautiful planet that we live on. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight, and I would be so happy to answer any questions that you have. Trees, which sounds like maybe not the safest lifestyle to embrace, but certainly an interesting one. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch every part of that sentence.
Are you considering moving to Africa permanently?
I think that to do work in Africa in the long term, to be close to the locations where I'm doing that research would make a lot of sense. Right now, it takes a little over 24 hours in the air to get from San Francisco Airport to the airstrip at the national park. And so that's a huge investment of time and a huge carbon footprint to get from here to there. So I think it would make a lot of sense to move to Africa permanently. And I would love to continue to use Swahili if I can. So maybe that'll come up.
This is the best way to get my cue.
Recently, a bird called roseate spoonbill was seen nearby. What's up, though? What can you tell us? Is that telling us anything? What was that bird doing?
Yeah. Yes. I'm glad that you brought that spoonbill up. I saw that same bird back in the spring when it was hanging out down in Kern County. And it was super exciting at the time because this was the first roseate spoonbill north of the Transverse Mountain Range since the late 70s. And so to wait 50 years for a bird to show up, I figured it was worth the drive down to Bakersfield. That bird, I think that it had juvenile plumage. And often when birds are young, they are more likely to do extended wanderings in search of a place to find appropriate food or breeding habitat. And so that certainly could have been part of that bird's story. Occasionally, storms will blow birds out of their usual range. I don't think that there were any storms immediately preceding that bird's arrival in the southern part of the Central Valley, but it did hang out long enough that it was acquiring enough food to survive in the long term. So it was down there for a couple of months and then began moving north. And that's not the case with every vagrant bird.
Are you saying it's the same individual?
Yes, I am saying it's the same individual. Yeah, yeah. Because it's a species that is so rarely found in California, and because there were sightings in between Stanislaus County and Kern County of a single roseate spoonbill, I think there's fair evidence to say it's the same individual. Yeah. But yeah, a lot of different biological and environmental factors could have driven that bird. Occasionally birds get parasites, and those parasites change the way that they orient, and so that can also cause vagrancy. In other cases, yeah, birds can undergo a directional migration difference, so they can turn basically 180 degrees. A bird that's supposed to migrate north to south will start migrating south to north and put itself in the Arctic Circle in late fall, which is a bad place to be if you're a little songbird that's meant for the tropics. So there are all sorts of ways in which avian vagrancy can happen. And if you have more questions about that, I have some papers that I love that I can share with you. Yeah. Yes?
What place do you want to travel to the most in order to study birds?
Ooh. So I have two answers to that question. The first one is Australia. It is an incredibly biodiverse place. That being said, my PhD advisor is from New Zealand, and so he would be a bit irate if I said Australia was my top choice. And New Zealand has some pretty cool birds, so I would say New Zealand is also towards the top of that list.
Questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any, do you have like a bird fact that most people wouldn't know?
Do I have a bird fact that what?
Most people wouldn't know.
Oh, yes. Which one to choose? So there is a bird that is poisonous, and that has only, I think that is a single instance in which that particular characteristic has evolved in birds. So I think a lot of people think of birds as like very benign, but like if you were to interact with this bird and experience those toxins, then maybe you'd think about birds a little bit differently. So that's certainly one that comes to mind.
Another question. Okay.
Yeah.
What's one bird that you wish that they would go extinct?
I wish no birds would go extinct. I think this is one of the amazing things about studying biodiversity is that that when you really fall in love with it, you appreciate it kind of warts and all. Like there becomes so much less of a hierarchy of like this bird is expendable and this one is one to prioritize. They're all so remarkable in their own ways. And so I would really hope that no bird goes extinct. There are a couple of species that come to mind. One is the regent honeyeater, a species that lives in Australia. It's down to less than 20 birds in the wild and is likely to be extinct in the next 3 to 5 years in the wild. There are captive populations of that species that could hang on longer, but reintroduction efforts of captive birds have been really fraught with that species, so I think it's unlikely that it'll have a long-term return to the wild. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I would say, like, if you want to talk to me about bird extinction, I would love to explore that more. It's I think one of the challenges when you love the planet that we live on is to say, like, this planet is experiencing such trauma and so much loss, and being a biologist, you bear witness to that, which is an emotional toll. And so I think one of the questions actually that I often ask people who are more advanced in their careers than I am is, how do you retain hope? What are your mechanisms for maintaining a personal posture of optimism towards the future that continues to enable you to do this really heavy work? So I'd love to talk with you more about that. Yeah.
Other questions up here?
Yeah.
What is the bird species that we should be on the lookout in this region? That's particularly one of your favorites.
So there are a couple of species that come through this region that are particularly long distance migrants that I think are pretty impressive. So shorebirds come to mind when I think of that. So birds that would pass through the Central Valley, but that would be breeding really high north in the Arctic and heading really far south to like coastal South America to overwinter. And so those would be things like marbled godwit, long-billed dowitcher, greater yellowlegs. So because that is my answer, I created an exhibit that is over at the Great Valley Museum that you would all be the very first people in the world to see this. Installation just completed today. And you would be welcome after this talk finishes to go over there and see that exhibit. And it features those 3 birds as well as yellow-billed magpie, with one of the birds that does not migrate at all, that's local endemic, and a couple of other species. So I would definitely invite you to go see that exhibit and then also pick up that question with me more. Yeah.
Sean, I would like to know now that you know this area, if you have any recommendations and places that we can go, people from this area, to go and see birds, and any the best places in the Central Valley.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that great question. Absolutely. So the San Luis National Wildlife Refuge is certainly one of them. Any area that has the historically present habitat types of the valley floor is really, really special because so much of it has been converted to agriculture and urban development, and that wildlife refuge is certainly one of them. And there are many other good ones in the broader region. Merced National Wildlife Refuge would be another one. Los Banos Wildlife Management Area would be a third. I would also recommend, there is a book that Elaine Gorman just wrote. She's with the Stanislaus Audubon Society, and it's called Valley Ventures, and it's destinations where you can go and take hikes and see birds that are within this area. So I would highly recommend that you look at that book, which is also at the bookstore at the Great Valley Museum. So, yeah.
If you happen to be at Wild Planet Day tomorrow, San Luis Wildlife National Refuge will be here with all the maps and places to go see birds.
Talking back to your previous self,
Yeah.
maybe a high school kid,
Sure.
or a college kid, could you give me 2 schools you would target to go to for undergraduate degree, for what you'd like to do, and then maybe if you were to change your major, what would it have been?
Oh, these are such good questions. 2 schools that I would target would be Occidental College in Los Angeles, which is another 4-year liberal arts college, but that has the world's largest Mexican bird specimen collection, and that's available for students to do research with under the umbrella of the Moore Laboratory of Zoology. That is a place where I worked during my master's, and I was so impressed by the quality of the education that undergraduate students there were receiving in bird work. For context for that particular location, there's an emphasis on genomics. And so if someone is interested in bird evolution or the speciation process or biogeography, great place to do that work. Second place that I would recommend for undergraduate work with birds would be Louisiana State University, which has a really robust museum and a fantastic set of opportunities for people to do field work as undergraduates. If I were to have changed my major, I think I really love languages, and I think I would have actually studied linguistics. So that would, I think, scratch that itch in a way that I've never been able to. There's a question down here. I've been hanging out for a while. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So how did you feel when you first collected dead birds for your field research or museum research?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's such a different way of experiencing birds than watching them healthy and well in their wild context. It's a kind of solemn process because you know that birds have died before this bird that you're picking up, and the birds will die again probably at the same window in the future. And so it's hard, kind of hard emotional work to do. But at a certain point, it also becomes very meditative because you're walking sometimes long distances between birds that are window kills, and so kind of appreciating that process of being out very, very first thing in the morning and finding these birds that have died the night before. The other funny thing, of course, about working in a museum is that as a vegetarian, I never interact with like dead animal flesh, and to work with it in a museum context, I needed to very much overcome the kind of ick factor that I would have experienced when I was a college student, for example. I was the kind of student who wouldn't like do the full dissection lab. I'd have my lab partner do it because it really bothered me. And then I think working at a museum exposed me to the scientific validity of preparing these specimens and what we can learn from them. And so I think that helped me kind of work through that emotional response. Yeah. That's great. I would, okay, yeah, let's take one more question. And then for anyone who does want to go over to the museum, I'm totally happy to go and hang out at that exhibit and answer more questions in person. Yeah.
So I heard that with increased urbanization, there's a certain selective force for birds to migrate to city areas, and also for birds that are endemic to city areas to survive in human habitations. And so, do you have any information on that? Because I've heard that there is a selective process there where birds have to compete for new settlements where humans are now settling. Do you have any information, or if any conservation efforts are being directed in response to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So cityscapes can support diversity in ways that we often don't appreciate, where there can be populations of birds or other creatures living in and reproducing within the broader cityscape. In some cases, those are self-sustaining populations, and so you end up with birds, in the case of birds in particular, you end up with species that are living generation over generation within the cityscape and have behavioral or ecological plasticity that's great enough to experience that totally novel landscape. In other cases, you have birds that are living within cities, but where they are not successfully reproducing. And so anytime that you're seeing that species within the city, it's because it was hatched outside of the city and then has moved into the city to access some of those, plant or habitat resources. And so this is called like a sink dynamic, an ecological sink, when a species is moving into an area but is not reproducing in that area. It seems to be good habitat, but in the long term, it's not sustaining those birds. So as a result, you do end up with some selective pressures that are going to change that, a species' ability to persist in a landscape. One of the things that we've seen with increased urbanization is an increase in background noise. And so in areas that are close to highways, you have a lot of low frequency noise that masks the sounds of a bird singing. And so birds begin to sing at even higher frequencies to be able to be heard above the highway noise. And that changes which male birds are appealing to the female birds. Because if you can imagine someone with a voice that sounds completely different from what you're expecting, then maybe that female bird doesn't perceive that as an appropriate mate. But for those that do, then it ends up selecting for that trait to be passed on. And some of that is behavioral. Sometimes an individual bird can sing above that frequency, and sometimes it's passed on. So it depends on the species. But those would be some of those dynamics, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about that too. Yeah. All right, well, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and especially all of you who have really hung out this whole time.